Said is not dead. No matter how many English teachers and Tumblr writing advice accounts try to drag her to the back alley and shoot her, she will continue to resurrect like Jesus Christ. Ever since I was new to writing, I always noticed that online there would be these big wheels full of different words as dialogue tags meant to be used to replace the word said. And on a surface level, they seem very helpful because they provide a list of words that new writers can use in order to convey character emotion and how they say something. However, there's a big problem with the fact that nobody knows how to use it in moderation. And more importantly, they tend to use it in replacement of the word said because they have been taught their entire writing career that said is dead. Said is not dead. Now, I'm not going to sit here and get mad at novice writers for internalizing the said is dead notion so deeply into their writing psyche, purely because of the fact, again, they've been told their entire lives that that's the case. Now, what I can do, though, is sit here and tell you why that is not exactly true and why that's so. Now, disclaimer, I am by no means a professional. I am just someone who is autistic with a special interest in writing and needs an outlet to yap to. Without further ado, let's get into it. First thing I want to start off with is explaining the purpose of said. The thing with dialogue tags such as said and asked is the fact that they are invisible words. They are short, monosyllabic, and words with a basic meaning and neutral connotation. This allows for a consistent flow throughout the story's pacing because of the fact that the reader's eyes tend to skip over these words. More expressive tags, especially ones that are 3 or more syllables, don't have that same invisibility, and that's their point. It's what makes using them less than said so important, because overusing these more fancy dialogue tags does 2 things. Number 1, it makes the flow of the story clunkier, and it also, number 2, lessens the impact that these more emotional words are meant to have on the reader. Going to the first point, it goes back to what I was saying about said and asked being these short monosyllabic words that makes them invisible. Because they're so short, they're easier for our brains to skim through and almost ignore. With longer, more polysyllabic words, that's not going to be easily the case because of the fact that our brains are clinging onto each sound. To the second point, you are oversaturating the readers with all these different tonal indicators that these dialogue tags usually have in them, which means in scenes that you might want a more gut-punchy emotional impact and you use these dialogue tags, the readers are already going to be numb to the effect that they should have in that scene that needs it. And now I'm going to bring it back to those wheel of dialogue tags that I was talking about earlier. Now, before I get jumped, I don't hate these things. They're clearly made with good intentions, and I'm sure they do help when used right. However, they're as useful as a thesaurus. Now, what I mean by that is that usually people rarely, if ever, take into account the connotative versus the denotative meanings of these words. And if you don't know what that means, well, denotative basically refers to the objective, factual, absolute meaning of the word, whereas connotative refers to the more emotional, suggestive, implied meaning of the word. So you look at something such as cheer, cry, and screech, they all technically have the denotative definition of shout, whereas their connotative definitions all vary. You wouldn't use cheer in the same way that you would use the word cry, you know what I'm saying? And not understanding the difference will get you stuck with this unnatural sounding prose, especially if you don't actually know the words, which will make you sound more amateur than if you just use said. Now, with all that said, get it? I understand not wanting to repeatedly use the word said because of the fact that it can sound redundant and it can become monotonous and all of that reason that you've probably been told over and over again. So, I will be sharing other alternatives that you should consider using in your writing. Number 1, the what I'm a slut for, action instead of dialogue tags. This can sometimes paint more of a picture in some ways that add variety, and it also operates as a perfect way to balance dialogue and action. I'll share 2 different examples of the same exchange of dialogue in order to kind of show you what I mean. I don't wanna, Jack whined. Go, now, Tess demanded. Now, compare it to something a little bit more like this. Jack stamped his foot, jutting his lower lip into a pout. I don't wanna! Tess pointed a demanding finger to the door. Go, she said. Now. That's a little bit more of a kick to it, don't you think? Now, obvious disclaimer, similar how you don't want to use said too much and you don't want to use flowery dialogue tags too much. You don't want to use action after dialogue too much because that runs the risk of choppy flow between the conversation, especially if the motions that you're putting the characters through just becomes repetitive at some point. And especially if the dialogue that's being had is of more importance than just having them move across the room. You know what I'm saying? Overall, it's just prioritizing what you think matters most and balancing it accordingly. Next thing to do, no dialogue tags, no action, just dialogue. Just the dialogue. Like this. These serve a lot of different purposes, so let me list my favorites real quick. Helps with flow. This one's pretty self-explanatory. You know, you have a fast-moving conversation where they're just throwing different jabs at each other, maybe in an argument between two characters. Dropping that she said, he said, they said can help with conveying that fastness. Now, let me read you an example. Travis groaned and stood up. Couldn't have come up with a safer escape? Emmett scowled and used his cane to climb to his feet. Excuse me if I was the only one thinking. You separated us, and standing around waiting for 6 unearthly, smiling, well-dressed shadows was a better idea? I don't know if you could tell at this point, but I'm also pulling some examples from my own writing and stories. I just wanted to make that clear in case any context just didn't make sense. I was originally not going to be that egotistical, but then I realized I'm too lazy to look for examples through the books on my shelf, so this is what you're getting. Anyway, back to my point. After establishing in the first 2 sets of dialogue who's speaking, we're able to now just have that back and forth between these 2 characters that can go so much faster because we drop the dialogue tags. Another way that I enjoy utilizing this technique is using it to place major emphasis on something, especially if it's a very short piece of dialogue. Some ideas that I personally enjoy is such as a character thinking big deep thoughts and then says something small. This example I kind of made up on the spot just right now because I could not find an example in my own writing, and just like before, I got lazy. So this probably isn't the best, but it's what I have for you. You're going to have to trust me. That sounded too hard, too scary. Tess was never one for trust. When had she ever been allowed that luxury? But still, those eyes held a level of sincerity. That extended hand held a promise. Okay, I trust you. See, the weight of those words has a whole lot more strength to them because of the fact that they are isolated in their single line, following a paragraph where we delve into the psyche of the character that we're in the head of. It's just so gorgeous. Another way of kind of doing this version of using the no dialogue tags, no action, just dialogue way of doing things to put major emphasis on something is the protagonist going through the horrors as someone else gives this monologue that we see in snippets in between the protagonist's random suffering and struggling. I have examples of this in my writing, but they're too long and need too much context for me to want to put in this video. So, I'm just going to give like a brief overview of what I mean. So let's say the villain is torturing the protagonist in some way. So we get, while giving some monologue about their personal ideals or blah, 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 blah. You know what I'm saying? So paragraph of the protagonist suffering and struggling and going through it. Next paragraph, or like space, and then random dialogue from the antagonist. And then more paragraphs upon paragraphs of the protagonist struggling and suffering and going through it. And then next paragraph over, another line of dialogue from the antagonist, and it's all just like that. And especially if it gets shorter and shorter and shorter as the antagonist continues talking. Oh, I eat that up. Anyway, I wish I could give an example, but I don't want to have to explain things. But I hope that kind of worked. And again, disclaimer, Obviously, don't overuse this one either, because that runs the risk of lack of clarity, especially if there's a scene with more than 2 characters in it. You are better likely to get away with this when it's a conversation between 2 characters. The only way that you can get away with this repeatedly with multiple characters is if they have a strong enough voice, and also if you do some other things that might indicate who's speaking. I guess I can give an example. It's not exactly, but it can kind of work. This is my example. "These are just like the ones in the Earth Spirit's underground temple," Outdone said with a grin. "Matt, can I use the phone to take pictures of these?" "I'm not the one with the phone." "Oh," Outdone said. "Akara?" "No." "Akara, give him the phone." Akara groaned and handed the phone to their little brother. And that's a pretty good example, in my opinion, of how deciding who gets a dialogue tag and who doesn't get a dialogue tag in order to make it as clarifying as possible when there's more than 2 characters having a conversation. Now, granted, I'm probably also a little bit biased because these are my characters, and so I know their voice best, and therefore who's speaking when someone's speaking. Might be a little bit different from you because you guys don't know who these characters are, but that's the best example I could give at the moment of what I mean when I'm saying make sure it's clarifying, but also it's a tool that you can use even in a conversation with 3 or more characters. Yeah. In conclusion, you shouldn't write off the power of said. Said, after all, is the default for a reason. It has its place in writing and in dialogue. And in general, you need a good balance of all these ways to connect dialogue to narrative in a way that doesn't detract from the immersion of the story. And that is a skill that you need to practice as a writer. Do dialogue exercises of any sort to help with that. And again, I'm no professional. However, I hope something I've said stuck with you and will help you out in your writing journey. This is Nuny the Random Fairy, and I'm flying out.